Welcome to today's podcast episode of Little by Little Homeschool. I am joined today by Dana K. White from A Slob Comes Clean, and I'm really excited about this episode. So welcome today, Dana.
Thank you so much for having me on. This is so fun.
Yes, it is. I'm looking forward to hearing all of these things. I've got some great questions for you. Can you start off and share a little bit about yourself so that the listener can get to know you?
Yeah. So we were talking beforehand, I'm a mom of 3. They are all young adults now. So they are about to be 19, 21, and 23. They are all away from home in college. And so we're empty nesters for the first time. But yeah, I teach about decluttering. That's my job that I made up about 16 years ago. So I didn't intend this to be the thing that I was going to teach, but this is where God's brought me. So.
It sounds like you were doing it out of, well, and we'll get to it, out of something that you just had to do for yourself, and then teaching it. I think that's the best things to teach other people is what we've actually walked through ourselves. And a lot of the moms that listen homeschool or are thinking about homeschooling. And so we can often feel like we're the only ones who struggle with keeping up with everything. And I think your story is going to resonate with a lot of moms. So how has your struggle to keep your home under control helped you understand God a bit more?
Yeah. So my story is that this is not the thing I was going to write about, but I did want to be a writer. Like that was my goal. So back in the days of blogging, remember back in the olden days people still blog, right? Like, I still have one, but like that was the big new thing. And I realized what they were. And I was like, oh my goodness, if I want to be a writer, I have got to do this thing. But my house was holding me back. So and when I say that, I don't just mean like, oh, it was kind of messy. No, I mean, it was like debilitatingly messy, right? Like it had been a struggle all my life. I was working on it, could not get it figured out. And so I thought, well, I mean, honestly, in a moment of crying out to God, why have you not cured me of my messiness? Because it's keeping me from starting this thing that I felt called by God to write, to encourage women. And so he gave me the idea to just write about that. So in the beginning, it was a practice blog. It was anonymous, right? Like I did not tell anybody what I was doing. I didn't even tell my husband what I was doing. I made up a fake name, didn't show my picture. I showed pictures of my messy spaces, but this was my deep, dark secret. And I thought, I'm going to work on this just to kind of learn about blogging for a couple months. Then my house will be perfect. And then I'll write about other things, right? And instead, this is the thing that God had planned for me all along. And, the thing that was the transformational moment for me, and I don't know that it was necessarily a one single moment, but the thing that God showed me as people started to read what I was writing, and I wasn't teaching, I was just figuring it out and writing about what I was figuring out. And people said, this is how my brain works. These are my struggles. And I saw who these people were. It was back in the days where you clicked on their name and you saw their profile, right? And I saw that and I thought, and I noticed that the common thread among the people who struggled with the same things that I did was creativity. And God showed me, Dana, this is how I made you. I created you with the brain that you have, and it's not a mistake. It's on purpose. And the fact that this is your struggle, that's not a mistake. Like the creative side of my brain that I'm very thankful for, and I say, thank you, God, for making me creative, right, is directly related to the fact that I see my space differently than the spaces than the people who are naturally organized, right? Like most of the organizing advice that I had ever read was written by naturally organized people because that's who wants to talk about this stuff, right? And their brains work very differently. So that acceptance of how God made me was incredibly freeing because it was not a matter of, oh, well, this is how I am. Now I'm not going to worry about my house anymore. Because it was never that I didn't want to. I was desperate to change my home. Instead, it was freedom to say, I don't have to feel like a failure because traditional organizing advice doesn't work for me. Instead, I just have to figure out what does work for me and the brain that God gave me when he made me. So there's a lot I've learned about God, but I would say that's the most transformational thing as far as this story goes.
Yeah, so it does sound like that is what you, I just love that you're like had this little practice blog and nobody knew about it. And isn't it just, I think it's just so cool how God uses our insecurities or the things that we struggle with to be able to reach other people. Because like I said, we feel like we're the only one. And that's such a good point that people who are naturally organized, they're the ones that are going to talk about it. And so people that were finding your blog were then really relating to you. And so you've written some previous books about cleaning and decluttering, and it didn't include any spiritual content. What made this the right time to share the spiritual side of your de-slobification journey?
Yeah, I mean, so the first three did not include that because God was showing me, Dana, this is not a spiritual failure. This is just the thing that you have to work harder on than other people, that your brain works differently, right? And so it was important to me to not include spiritual content in those first three books, because a lot of times when you have spiritual content mixed in with cleaning advice and organizing advice, for the person like me, who this was my shameful frustration, it took this thing that was already a frustration, and then it was usually written by somebody who was speaking a language I didn't understand of organizing, and me feeling confused. And then you add in the spiritual thing, and then it felt like it was a spiritual failure, right? Like it just kind of piled on and made me feel so incredibly hopeless. And so because he was showing me, Dana, no, I don't care about your messy house. That's never what I've been asking you for, right? I didn't want to mix those things together. And yet the shame aspect of this for the person who, like me, who legitimately struggles is really intense. And so I felt like it was important to address that. Well, I'm a believer, and my audience knows that I'm a Christian. I've always been very open about my faith, but I was writing about cleaning and organizing, and I was not mixing in, spiritual inspiration with that on purpose. But if I'm going to write about the shame, then for me, that I have to talk about the God side of that, right? Because that is ultimately the way the shame is gone for me, is because of what Jesus has already done for me. This idea that I've got to do this thing and do this thing well in order to please Jesus is actually me not understanding what Jesus is looking for from me, right? Like it is not about anything I do, because I can't do anything to get closer to God. I can only acknowledge and accept and surrender to what he's already done for me, right? So that, and also just the reality that I have a large platform now, and I take that very seriously, and my faith is ultimately the only thing that matters. So it was really important to me to share my faith with, the people who follow me, because there are a lot of people who I think of me as their only Christian friend, because as you're a podcaster, you spend time with people, even though they know my face and they know my voice, that I may not know their face or their voice. We're friends. We have this very real relationship. And so, I needed to share the spiritual side of that. So.
Yeah. It sounds like it was just time. And God leads us to when the right time is, and to pull that in. And that shame part, we can experience that in a lot of different areas. We all probably have something that maybe we feel ashamed of, and the only way we're going to get freedom is through Jesus. And being able to then heal probably that maybe emotional aspect of it was probably like the final, I feel like maybe it's like the icing on the cake or the cherry on top or something like that after you've written your other books. And then now let's really work through this.
Well, and the reality is that, Jesus doesn't care about your messy house is a kind of blunt title, right? Like it's, it's funny because I think the sales team in a meeting, my editor told me that the sales team was like, are we sure about this title? And thankfully my editor was like, yeah, it's exactly what the book is, and there are multiple reasons for that, right? Like, because I have an audience that is not a Christian audience, they know me, I'm not one to bait and switch, right? Like I'm like, hey, Jesus is in the title. So if you're going to read it, you already know that this book is about Jesus, right? It's also, I mean what I say. Jesus doesn't care about your messy house, which can make people very uncomfortable, because it's a sentence that I absolutely mean, but there's so much depth there, to talk about why and what that means and what that looks like to live in grace. And yet my target audience, that's what they need to hear, right? Because they're the same people like me who were scared to read Christian books about organizing, right? Because I felt like it's only going to make me feel more despair. And so anyway, why did I get on that subject? I don't remember. But.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. I mean, a lot of freedom is probably just in that title, and yes, can be like a lot of relation. So let's talk about the cleanliness. And the phrase of cleanliness is next to godliness apparently is not in the Bible, right? So why do we feel like it's a biblical principle?
Yeah. So when you Google, which I did, I was like, okay, so I knew it wasn't in the Bible, but I was like, I'm just going to Google, is it in the Bible? All of the answers gave some version of this answer. No, but the concept is there. And then they would go on to refer to the Proverbs 31 woman. So I was like, well, let's go tackle that, right? You know what's never mentioned in Proverbs 31? The state of her home, anything about cleaning, anything about organizing, anything that even is another word for cleaning or organizing. But the thing that's very clear is that she's not lazy. So the assumption is, and this is the assumption, not just in the Christian world, right? Like in general, people looking from the outside and people who do not struggle with this issue, the assumption is that the reason for a messy house is laziness. And I'm here to say that is absolutely not true. Okay. Not that laziness can't play a part. Of course it can, right? However, it, for me, was not for lack of trying, right? Now that I have my house under control because I understand the principles that did not come naturally to me, I spend so much less time working on my house than I used to. Right? I was constantly working with nothing to show for it. So it is not for a lack of trying. And yet when someone tries to be helpful, then they say things like cleanliness is next to godliness. And that's not helpful, right? Like they're thinking that they're being helpful by saying this. Well, it's actually a very dangerous phrase because anything that I think is getting me closer to God that I'm doing means I don't actually understand what it means to be closer to God, right? Because I have to understand who he is, who I am, and what that relationship is, which is not based on my works, right? So it's a dangerous phrase, but I think it comes down to people assuming that it's a lack of caring, it's a lack of trying, it's a lack of, all this. And I didn't really want to be the poster child for the person who struggles, but I'm willing to do it because I know how important it was for me when people told me, me too, like they told me that I wasn't the only one. And that was so transformational for me. And I hear it from people on a daily basis that is transformational for them to know that they're not the only one, that they're not broken, and for people to not misjudge the reason why this is a struggle. And so I'm willing to be that person who talks about it.
No, that's good. It's kind of like, I think sometimes when maybe you get together with girlfriends or there's just something that somebody needs, there's something that needs to be said, and just like be the person to like say the thing, get it out, and everybody can have that conversation. That's, so what do you really think about this or something? It just be the person to kind of start. And I think people appreciate that. And the ones that don't aren't your people. So yeah, it's okay. So I appreciate you saying that it's not for a lack of trying, because I think that on the other side are people who are hyper organized and then can pass judgment on others and think about that. So if, say, you are somebody who is pretty organized and you have a friend that needs some help, is there a way that this person can approach and offer help? Or is it something that, do you feel like it's a personal thing that you just kind of go to all your resources to kind of walk them through? Or how do you see that?
It's tough because there's not a quick, simple answer, and every person is unique. Every relationship is unique. I think the number one thing to do is to understand, right? To understand that this is a legitimate struggle, that their brain works differently than your brain, right? Because so many times, and that's, I have a chapter in there called technically helping, but not actually helping, right? Like all the phrases, or, thinking that, hey, did you know that it would be easier to cook in your kitchen if it was not so cluttered and messy? That's not helpful, right? But the person saying it thinks it's helpful, but it doesn't actually get down to the nitty gritty of how do I make that happen, right? Like, what is it? So the first step is just to take these preconceived notions about what it is that they need and go, okay, this is a legitimate struggle. They think differently than I do. And also everybody has a struggle. Like we all have one, right? So if this isn't your struggle, be thankful for that, but also know that, they may need to look at it differently. So I have a decluttering process, and one of those, I created the process, and then I was told this process works amazingly when I use it to help other people, because it doesn't use value judgments, and it lets the person whose stuff it is make all the decisions, but those decisions are based in the reality of their space and the reality of what they know they have and all that kind of stuff. So yes, I would say go read Decluttering at the Speed of Life.
Okay.
I really would, though. I think that you may at some point go, wow, people think this way. But yes, we do. So
no, I think it's important to point out that we all have a struggle, and
absolutely,
whether, it can be obvious. I feel like it's probably always obvious to at least to our family, but it's not always obvious to other people. And to remember that grace, and going back to that, the cleanliness is next to godliness. And just, that's such a good point that if that's true, then we have to do something in order to get closer to God. And we don't need to. Jesus already did it. And that he has wired us all a little bit differently. And I like that you have realized how you've been wired and being able to reach other moms. So I'm hopefully the moms that are listening, they're like, yes, I think, okay, I think there's someone out there who kind of gets me. And the fact that you're a couple of steps ahead is very helpful for them. So
yeah. Well, I was going to say one example is the, a place for everything and everything in its place. That is something that organized people love to say. And it actually is true. However, for the person who has a brain like me, it is not the least bit helpful to say that, because it didn't make sense to me, because I was like, I have a lot of things that have no place to go, right? And so there were a lot of different understandings of the reality of space and how this all works that I had to get down before that phrase made sense. And because of my past experience with it, it still gets on my nerves to hear it, right? Even though it's true. But the reason it got on my nerves so much is people felt like that was the answer. It's true, but it's not actually helpful to the person who's struggling.
That's a good point. Thank you. Thank you for that. What's the balance between messiness not being a spiritual issue and then everything being a spiritual issue?
Yeah, it comes down to your heart. It comes down to your motivation, your posture toward God and toward others, right? So anything and everything, we need to give it to God to use as he pleases, right? Like that's part of laying our lives down and saying, okay, God, whatever it is that you have, that's the thing, and not what I want. So examples would be, if I have a pile of clutter on my dining room table, that in itself is not a sin, right? Like it happens, and it happens more often for the person like me who has no awareness when something is leaving my hand, right? Or where it left my hand. And so that is just reality. So this pile is not there. The pile is not a sin. And yet, if somebody needs a place to go, they need to come inside my home. They need to be, I need to show them God's love. And I say, okay, you can't come in because I'm embarrassed about that pile. Well, then that is a posture of my heart where I'm being prideful and selfish. I don't like it. I don't want them to see the pile. And hopefully the motivation is for me to deal with the pile, but also let them in even before it's dealt with, right? But then also if I go, you know what, there's nowhere to sit because of all the mess, and that's their problem. They can't judge me. Well, then that's my heart, again, being selfish, right? So all of these things go together. It all comes down to your heart. Like in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about situation after situation after situation that church is dealing with, right? And he's like, well, if you look at it this way, I mean, this, and then this, and then this. And he goes, but it all comes down to the heart. It all comes down to love. Like, are you loving the other person, and are you putting their need to feel loved by you, and therefore experience the love of God through you first? Or are you putting your own pride and your own rights and your own all this? Or which one of those are you putting first? So it all comes down to the heart. And that's where we have to, if I'm the person on this side of the doorbell who's scared to open it, it's on me, my heart. If I'm the person on the other side of the doorbell wanting to go into somebody's house, it's my own heart is on me, right? Like, I have to examine my own heart in whatever position I am in this situation.
So it sounds like there's a balance between being able to use your home to serve others. I mean, I would assume that includes our family as well, and possibly holding you back from being able to do that. Is that what I'm getting? Okay. Yeah. And so I think also family. So a lot of the moms that listen homeschool. And so our kids are home with us every day, all day. And there's a constant mess. It's not always us putting things down. It's them putting things down. And so, yeah, it could be a struggle because it's not just, it's the constant put this here and put this there, and it doesn't always quite get there. And the pile that maybe is on the steps that everybody seems to walk past and not ever see that needs to be taken up to their bedrooms is a kind of a constant thing. So yeah, thank you for this. Can you share, where can the listener get your books? I know you have this latest book. Maybe where do you suggest that they start off, and where can we send them?
Well, if you Google Dana K. White, you have to put the K in there because there's a man named Dana White, and that's not me. But if you put Dana K. White, wherever books are sold, you'll find my website, my YouTube channel, my podcast, all that. But the name of my website is A Slob Comes Clean. That's the secret blog I started back when. It still exists. So yeah, I'm everywhere, basically, it feels like.
Okay. So that was the secret website. That was the name of it. And then you just stuck with it.
I did.
I love it. Can I ask, how did you start to tell people, like within, I mean, you said your husband didn't know at first, and friends, and how did you start to let them know that you were doing this?
Well, with my husband, I let him know probably about a month in. I was like, hey, because he knew I'd wanted to start a blog. And so he was excited. Like, he was really excited that I was doing it. When I wrote my first ebook, which is now like included in my first traditionally published book, it's like the back part of that, appendix of that. I was like, okay, I wanted to be a writer. I'm writing this thing. I've put a lot of work and sweat and tears and struggle into this thing. And I was like, I really want to use my real name, because I was creating this product, and I made the decision to go ahead and use my real name. So that was about 2.5 years in. As far as my real life, I still don't bring it up unless it comes up, which it does. If somebody asks you what you do, then it comes up, but I don't volunteer the information immediately. But really it came down to, as my kids got older and people started to ask me what I was doing with my time, I was like, okay, I'm not going to lie, right? Like, so it kind of became this thing of either people think of stuff for me to do with my time, or I tell them, you know what, I actually have a business that I've created, here. So at that point, I just started answering those questions honestly. So not that I was answering them, I was just avoiding them before. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I've encountered that too with podcasting and my kids being older too. And people are like, oh, so, and I'm like, if you say you're busy, they're like, what are you busy doing? Like you're only homeschooling one kid who's 17, and that, he's pretty well independent. And so my family, because I've had this podcast for a couple of years. And so they became the ones that would be like, oh, or something, we get to know people and they're like, oh, she has a podcast. And then of course the people pull out their phone and I'm like, no, don't look it up. It is a weird thing
it is so weird.
The online to meet the, in real life kind of thing, and people to know. Whereas you used to just have a job and you go work, you're a bank teller, or you go work at the grocery store, you work in an office and nobody sees you. And so I appreciate what you're doing. And I know a lot of moms who think similarly to you are going to really be blessed by this, and blessed by you stepping out and starting this and then continuing to do it. And I think it's just really cool how you had this desire and this dream that God put into your heart to write books. and how unlikely that this was the topic and you didn't think it was going to be.
This is the actual last thing I would have ever thought. But it's so much more rewarding, because I don't have to pretend anything because I've already, called myself a slob and admitted that this is my struggle, but I have figured it out. And so I get to give that hope that I know I was desperate for. I get to give that to other people. And so that's like so fun.
Yes, that's a great way to end, just that hope that you are able to give. There is hope. So if this is a struggle that you have, please go check out the links in the show notes, connect with Dana, and she'll walk you right through it. So Dana, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me on. This is really fun.
Thank you for listening, friend. I'd love to connect with you more. You can find social media links in the show notes and share this episode with a friend who could use a boost to her homeschool. See you back here real soon.